Hello, everyone. Hello, Europe. Yeah, it's absolutely wonderful to be able to speak to 60, 70 people from at least 20 countries from my apartment here in Reykjavik. I welcome you all. This is a great pleasure. I miss not being able to see your faces, but I learned a little bit about you from the response to the questions that you have already submitted, and I've learned that half of you don't know a great deal about Barnahus. So what I will try to do is to do my presentation in a sort of elementary way, but still I will put in some of the more advanced stuff, so everyone will get something for their money, so to speak. Yeah, I will start out by talking a little bit about why Barnahus is a viable response to child abuse, and why we should strive for its implementation around Europe. We know that if we look at the justice system in European countries, as well as other systems like child protection system in general, we may be able to identify numerous defaults, if you like, or difficulties with regard to children in contact with the system. We know the justice system, the real object of it is to determine guilt or innocence and apply the rules of the due process, rather than specifically operating in the best interest of the child. And if we look generally, if you give a general picture, so to speak, all over the situation in Europe, we can identify at least four major problems that we are facing when we look at the best interest of the child. And the first thing is the multiple interviews that children are subjected to in different locations, and the corresponding re-victimization of child victims. And I will talk a bit about this. But this is to be found, moreover, more or less all over Europe. The second issue here is the period from the investigation and until the trial starts. And this may be a duration of many, many months and even years in some parts of Europe. 1 year is not uncommon. And this puts the child in a very tough situation. And we must remember that the children's perception of time is very different from us who are middle-aged or even older. As children feel time to go extremely, sort of pass extremely slowly. And during this waiting period, children have described this as you know, that their life is more or less on the hold. And they are in a very paradoxical situation. On the one hand, they are trying to sort of move away from the trauma of the abuse by trying to even forget the abusive act. But on the other, there is this demand that they remember every detail of the abuse, so they will be able to testify in court during the court procedure. And this is an extremely tough situation for children. Now, the third aspect I would like to mention is the hostile cross-examination that you can find in some of the European states. I know that in many countries a lot has been done to modify this, but still in quite many countries it is common that children are expected to be there in the courthouse, or at least that the defendant is allowed to cross-examine the child and ask in a hostile and intimidating manner about the detail of the abuse. And the final issue I should like to mention is the lack of appropriate sort of medical evaluation, not to mention the therapeutic services that are very fragmented in many countries in Europe. Now, having said this, I want to now to talk about the Barnahus a bit, because the Barnahus is really the response to these issues that I have mentioned, these problems. The Barnahus has now assumed a key role in the justice as well as the child protection system of the Nordic countries, and beyond, in fact, because allowing for some difficulties of definition, Barnahus can now be found in about 60 locations in Europe, in Iceland, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, and more recently in the Baltic Sea states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, Poland, and Hungary. Cyprus, and there are potentially more countries coming in. The Netherlands and England are examples. Now, the Barnahus to mention in particularly the IPSCAN, the International Society for the Prevention of Child Abuse and Neglect, that awarded Barnahus their multidisciplinary award in 2006, and the Council of Europe, the Lanzarote Committee, which is the monitoring body of the Lanzarote Convention on the Protection of Children Against Sexual Abuse and Sexual Exploitation, the Congress of Local and Regional Authorities. They've all recommended it, and the EU, of course, through the PROMISE project, has really been supporting it. Now, how did Barnahus come into being? Barnahus was founded in Iceland in 1998. It was very much rooted in the principles of the child-friendly, multi-agency and interdisciplinary features of the Children's Advocacy Center model in the USA. And Barnahus was really based on this, applying the US long-standing tradition of an investigative approach in child protection and criminal justice, but very much geared in its making of the great legacy of the Nordic welfare model and the principles of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Now, if you are interested in learning more about the difference between Barnahus and the CAC, we can turn to that maybe afterwards in the questions and answers. Now, the Barnahus is set up as a response to child sexual abuse, and that was how it was implemented in Iceland. But when Sweden, Norway, and Denmark later implemented it, they took on all types of abuse of children, all types of violence against children. And so it's really applicable, the model, in covering really the whole range of violence and abuse that children may be subjected to. But in my presentation, I will ask you to think a little bit about child sexual abuse, although it really applies to physical abuse and domestic violence more or less the same. Now, if we talk about child sexual abuse, we know the uniqueness of the crime of child sexual abuse. That is, it stems from the fact that the vulnerability of the child victim plays a significant role here. This is different from all other types of crime, where, for example, adults are involved, where we report to the police that we have been victims of crime. But however, we all know, and I don't need to go into that in any detail, that children have enormous difficulty in disclosing about their abuse. There are so many reasons for children not to disclose that there are probably a lot more good reasons for not to disclose rather than to tell. Now, the second issue here is also that the perpetrator, unlike the other types of crime, the perpetrator most often is in the circle of trust of the child, which means that the child has all kinds of feelings, and particularly warm feelings towards the offender, and that creates additional problems with regard to the disclosure. Now, the third aspect I would like to mention is the lack of or even absence of evidence other than the child's disclosure. And we know, for example, in the medical evidence that they exist in less than 10% of cases, and their conclusion in less than 5% of all cases. And other hard evidence or witnesses to the abuse very rarely exist. So this means, in fact, that the child's story, the child's narrative, is really key for unlocking the crime. Now, if we look at the actual intervention, then again we see the uniqueness of the intervention of child abuse compared to other types of crimes. And this is so because addressing child abuse is not only a judicial issue, but requires a multi-agency intervention. So, we are here talking about, of course, that the medical sector, the child protection, and the social services need to come into the picture besides the judicial system. So we know that the child's disclosure, the child narrative, is really the key for all of these different agencies to be able to perform their function. And that's why we have this situation of multiple interviews, which are so harmful to the child victim. All these different agencies, they need to have the child account, and this oftentimes leads to repetitive interviews by many professionals in different locations. Now, this has, of course, this harmful effect on the child in terms of re-traumatization. This has been clearly demonstrated by research, but it's also, and very importantly, it's very harmful for the criminal investigation, as we know that the repetitive and unstructured interview can distort the child's account. And this happens when children are repeatedly asked by people who are not specifically trained. They are asked in a suggestible manner, leading and misleading questions, and children, they respond to these questions as they think is the correct answer, or as they think the adult person wants to hear the answers. So what happens is that the child's narrative becomes contaminated. So there will be, in the end, discrepancies in the child's story. The evidential value of the narrative therefore diminishes. So the problem is that you can't really use the narrative, for example, to take the case forward in the court system. Now, there is also additional harmful experience that children are subjected to, which is the environment in which they are interrogated or being interviewed. And we know that oftentimes this environment is not particularly child-friendly, whether that be police stations or hospitals or social service offices and so on. And this can be extremely harmful. We know that the higher level of stress that the child is subjected to, the less likely it is that the child will be able to tell us the full and rich story from the child's experience. Now, also, there may be all sorts of implications. For example, for taking a child to the police station, well, you taken to a police station. So the child may mistakenly infer that he or she may have done something wrong. Same as hospitals. All children know that it's particularly patients that are taken to hospitals. But of course, child victims of sexual abuse are no patients, they are healthy children generally. Now, this was the situation in Iceland in 1998 when we did a thorough research on the situation. And we were very much aware of this defaults of our system. And we decided to do something about it, and we managed to, fortunately, make progress in that. We first had a look at the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, particularly Article 3, which emphasized the obligation of all social welfare institutions, whether public or private, court of law, administrative authorities, or legislative bodies, to prioritize the best interests of the child. And that is obvious that this would require a multi-agencies collaboration. And what we did was to come together, all the different agencies that had a role to play, had a legal obligation to intervene in these cases. And this generally meant, in Iceland, it was the Child Protection Services, the police and the prosecution, and the health sector. And we decided, to cut a long story short, to set up a facility, a house, in which all these different agencies could work together under one roof, with the purpose of ensuring that the child only would need to go to a one place, child-friendly place, to get the comprehensive services that was needed. So this is the Barnahus in Iceland. It's located in a residential area, in a nice residential area. It is designed to meet the children's needs. You can see pictures made by children on the walls there, and you can see playrooms, age appropriate here. You can see the waiting room for younger children, and this is for the teenager. So, in generally, we are trying there to create an environment that is positive for the child. Now, Barnahus, the concept is really that all the functions that need to be carried out in terms of investigation, as well as the therapeutic intervention for the child, are being carried out within the same roof. So the key really of the activity is the joint investigative interview. We will come back to that later. And then we have a medical examination room. We have also facilities for victim therapy and counseling for families, non-offending parents and other significant other for the child. And there are also some very important functions, which are the consultation and advice to the local child protection services, and education, training, and research. Because Barnahus accumulates a great deal of experience, knowledge, and data that's very important to disseminate among the professionals and public alike to raise awareness. Now, the joint investigative interview is really key to the services in Barnahus, really key to the activities. Now, in Iceland, we implemented there are sort of two kinds of interviews that we carry out. One is the court interview, and I will talk in more details about these. And the other is what we call an exploratory interview. Now, we'll start with the court interview. When the child has disclosed in a very clear manner and points to the perpetrator, the offender who is responsible, we refer the case to the police, who will notify a court judge, who will have a hearing and decide on a hearing in Barnahus. And present in the hearing are, besides the court judge, who is in the charge of the procedure, are the representatives of all these different agencies. You will see the representative of the prosecution, the police, the local child protection services, the child's legal advocate, and very importantly, the defense lawyer. And this is important because we want to ensure an arrangement where the principle of the due process or the fair trial is clearly ensured. And if we manage to do that, we can save the child from having to come to court at a later stage to testify if the case is indicted. And so this is a crucial moment. Now, you don't need necessarily to have the arrangement that the court judge is in charge of this operation. In, for example, Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, the prosecution or the police may be in charge of this proceeding. It is implemented more or less in the same manner. However, if we do that, you need to make sure that the defense has at some point in the proceeding access to the child in order to exercise the rights of the defendant to the equality of arms, that is to say, to ask questions. And in Norway, for example, they typically do it in terms of 2 interviews. First, it's a police interview, where only the child, besides the child, it's only the police there. There's no defense or no one else. After that, they interrogate the alleged offender, and the outcome of this is typically some discrepancies in the count. There may be an agreement about 80–90% of what has happened, but then they have a second interview, which is basically focused on the discrepancies in disclosure or in narratives. And this they call the supplementary interview is only confined to this where the discrepancies are, and it is at this stage where the defense is allowed to step in. So you can make this arrangement without the court judge being there in charge of this procedure. The main issue here is that the child disclosure is elicited by a trained forensic interviewer that is interviewing the child according to evidence-based interview protocol. And this is all videotaped for the purposes of court hearings. Now, this arrangement, like I said, this is to ensure that we are balancing these principles of human rights. On the one hand, the due process or the fair trial, and on the other, the best interest of the child. And this can be applied both in adversarial as well as inquisitorial legal system. So both of these systems, in fact, allow for such an arrangement. And it should be stated that the Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg has confirmed that this is in line with this arrangement is in line with the basic human rights principles. Now, I just put in here a picture of which demonstrates how important this is in terms of for the child, how speedily this can be done. This picture shows you the duration from the time a request is made for court testimony until it takes place in Iceland. And you can see that half of the testimonies, they take place within the first week of the child's disclosure. And within 2 weeks, you have 80% of disclosures being taken, and almost all are taken within the first 3 weeks. Now, this means that within the space of 3 weeks, the child victim has given his or her testimony for the court purposes, and the child has done with the justice system. And we can focus on the healing process. We can focus on the therapy without having to worry about the court at all. Now, the other type of interviews we do are what we call exploratory interviews. Now, a great many of the disclosures of children are not very clear, maybe a bit ambiguous, or it may not include an identification of the offender. And then we can do these exploratory interviews at the request of the Child Protection Services. And this is done when the disclosure is absent, very weak or ambiguous. It may be absent, but there has, of course, to be some significant identification or suspicion that the child has been abused. It may be through behavior, over-sexualized behavior, or whatever. So we can try to elicit some sort of verbal disclosure. And in cases where the offender is below the age of criminal responsibility, which is 15 years in Iceland, we use these exploratory interviews. I should mention they are all carried out with the same evidence-based protocol, and they are recorded. If a child confirms or discloses in these exploratory interviews, we stop simply and then the case would be referred to the police, and we would have a court interview at a later stage. Now, this is the interviewing room. It's a small room to create a kind of an atmosphere of closeness between the interviewer and the child. They're alone there. And this is the camera in the corner. This is the monitoring room where the court judge would sit and the representatives of all the different agencies plus the defense. And we can also do this in the courtroom. If the, for example, let's offender, if he demands to observe alive the interview, which he has right to in the Icelandic law, I wouldn't recommend it, but he has. This happens maybe once a year that the offender, he demands to himself observe the interview. Then the whole procedure moves to the courthouse. However, the child is in the children's house and the interviewer, and so this can be transmitted by the IT technology. Now, in Barnahus, we also have a medical examination room. This is done at the request of the police, the child protection services, the child or the parents, and this is implemented by experienced pediatrician, a gynecologist, and a trained nurse. Very importantly, this is done in a child-friendly examination room, and we use a video colposcope. That's an equipment, a state-of-the-art equipment. You can see it here. And the beauty of it is that you can examine the child without penetrating the child. And you don't need to use anesthesia at all. The child is awake during the whole examination and can observe on the TV screen how it is going. And this has a great sort of therapeutic implications, because the medical people, they're communicating with the child during the whole procedure, assuring the child that he or she is perfectly healthy, which is the case, of course, in the vast majority of cases. So you can actually observe how children, traumatized children, come into the medical room, and when the medical examination is over, how they are greatly relieved. Now, the victim therapy can start immediately after the forensic interview, as I mentioned earlier. Now, it starts off by an assessment, which is made by observing the disclosure on the video, and we never mix the staff who are on the one hand doing the investigative part, the interviewing part, and the other, the therapist. These dual roles should be excluded. And we are basically applying trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, which is the sort of the evidence-based procedure to use. But there are other types of evidence-based therapeutic provisions that can be applied as well. Now, very importantly, the therapist, he plays a very important role during the court proceedings, because they are generally required to submit the reports and testify during proceedings. Now, we have now about 20 years experience. We will celebrate the Barnahus the coming September, the 20th anniversary. And of course, you are very welcome to come. It's on the 5th of September here in Reykjavik. We have received more than 5,000 children, and that's quite a lot, bearing in mind that the total child population in Iceland is just under 70,000. We have been receiving 250 to 300 children annually in recent years. And we can identify the enhanced credibility results in the increase of reports of child abuse. We have seen, for example, in terms of child sexual abuse, that cases investigated have more than doubled, indictments per year have tripled, convictions per year have more than doubled, and we can provide appropriate treatment without delay. And it's not limited to victims in cases that meet the criteria for burden of proof, which is common. We can start and we do start the therapy immediately if we are convinced that an abuse has taken place and the child has been victimized. So we don't need to have a court decision on that. Now, the evaluation in Iceland shows significantly better outcomes from child victims and families, and the same has been demonstrated in the other Scandinavian countries where evaluation has been carried out. Now, I will end up by saying that Barnahus, as I mentioned earlier, was implemented in the other Nordic countries from 2005 in Sweden, 2007 in Norway, 2013 in Denmark. And it's highly interesting to examine how different paths of implementation you can identify in these countries, how they come into being, the role of the state, regional, and the local authorities. The legislative framework may differ substantially, the affiliations, how the juxtaposition of responsibility of partners are being clustered, the collaboration, how structured it is. The target group that I mentioned in Iceland, it was child sexual abuse first, but now we are doing physical abuse, domestic violence, and even we invite the unaccompanied minors to come to Barnahus for telling their story. The methods of investigative interviews in Iceland, it is social workers and child psychologists who are trained in carrying out the investigative interview. The medical examination may be different than treatment strategies, but the concept is the same. We have now the first scientific publication, a comparative analysis on how Barnahus can be implemented. That was published last year. This should be 2017, not 2007. I'm sorry. I guess I can see on the screen. You can see, you can access the publication, the book that is published by Palgrave. You can access it on the internet, and the link is referred to there on the picture. Now, the promise, I don't need to talk much about the promise. Shauna already has done that. But this has been the first systemic attempt to bring together European states for the purpose of implementing Barnahus. And one of the greatest achievements that already has been made is the European Barnahus standards. This is the first really systemic attempt to establish quality standards for child-friendly and multi-agency response to child abuse in the European context. And it addresses the evidence-based components of Barnahus, including the structured forensic interviews, medical examination, and therapeutic services. However, it's very important to realize that these standards, they ensure the necessary flexibility to allow for implementation in diverse social and legal environment with the necessary fidelity required for the professional implementation. Now, this is the reason for I often am a bit sort of skeptical to talk about Barnahus model. I would prefer even to talk about the Barnahus concept, because it's not a recipe, but it contains the ingredients that you can make your own recipes in your own country for its implementation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bragi, for a wonderful presentation. I hope it was interesting for everybody to hear, and please feel free to start with your comments. I give floor to Shana once again at this point, I think, so that she can tell you the final remarks about the PROMISE project. And we will be here waiting for your comments. Bragi, feel free to keep your camera on, because we are waiting for comments, and those will be mainly for you. Shana, here you go.
Hi, yes, thank you. I just wanted to thank you all once again. 70 plus people stayed the whole time, which is really incredible. Bragi is here for questions, and I hope that you write them down in the chat. And I wanted to point one more time to the PROMISE newsletter, is how you can keep informed about the upcoming webinars for the rest of the project, and also we're publishing a lot of news about what's happening with new Barnahuses being launched and other interesting things going on as well. And in the web links box down in the bottom left, there's a lot of things that you should take a look at. So the Barnahus standards is what Bragi was just talking about. That will lead you directly to the page where all of the different versions of the standards are available. Those are being translated, and the translations will be coming available soon. And yeah, I turn it over to if there's any questions. I see that Turid has one. What is the major learning during the process of establishing Barnahus? What are the pitfalls and advances to meeting them? And then there's another question that came in. What is the level and type of training required for the interviewers, and who provides this? Bragi, maybe you want to take it from here?
Okay. Well, in terms of the major learnings during the process of establishing Barnahus, I think it is the respect for the mutual respect of the different professions involved, and that is both the prerequisite for being successful in setting up Barnahus, and this is really the core of it, to be able to build a mutual trust between the different professions. I think that's the pitfalls is the opposite. If one tries to discriminate between the professions or agencies, to make one particular agency the main agency and have the others serve the needs of the main agency, that doesn't work. You have to approach this all on equal terms. And we all the different agencies, they have their defined roles, and their in the law, they continue to assume the same responsibility as they have always done in the law, but they implement it differently, and they work together to facilitate each other's work for the benefit of the children. Now, there was the second question was, the level of type of training required for interviewers and who provides this. Now, the interviewers in Iceland, they are all trained in the USA, in Huntsville, Alabama. They have on a regular basis, they have trainings that are being implemented, in fact, all over the USA. And there are more agencies in the USA that provide these training, but also in Europe, there are as well agencies that do provide the training. The protocols that are applied today are maybe 2 or 3 types, but they are pretty similar, and I wouldn't like to discriminate between them, but we can help you out in terms of identifying the most appropriate partner to confer with on this. Can we have some more questions?
Thank you for those questions so far. I can read you a bit more. A question from Elvis. First question, is the child aware of the multi-agency professionals that are attending the interview? And then second question is, usually how many sessions are offered at Barnahus?
Yes. Thank you, Elvis, for that question. Let me see. Now I lost the question. Yes, the child is always aware of this. We inform the child when the child arrives in Barnahus, so the child is informed about all of this. And that's very important, because we explain to the child that we do not like to have any secrets, and want to have this all transparent. And this has this normally has no negative effect on the child. Children are very adaptable to this, and typically after a couple of minutes they forget all about the camera and that someone is observing. Now, with regard to the trauma-focused cognitive behavior therapy sessions and how many sessions there are, this depends very much on the nature of the abuse. If the abuse has been for a long duration of time and the perpetrator is very close to the child, member of the family or the circle of trust, you can expect the therapy sessions to be quite many, in fact, maybe 20, 30 or even more with follow-up. However, if this is a one incident abuse by a stranger, typically the repercussions are not as severe, so you don't need all that many interviews. But then again, it's very it cannot be sort of determined in advance. Children are different, and you need to make an individual plan. Some are very resilient, while others are very sensitive. So it can be from 2 or 3, which is the minimum, to maybe 20, 30, which is somewhere in between is probably the most common. Let me see if there are more. Yes, there is. The next question is about from Carmen about the resources needed associated to establish these services. Now, this may differ from one country to another. It's difficult to tell really to what kind of how I should really measure it. You really need. It depends on how many children you are expected to receive, and but I'd have to have at least a core staff members at Barnahus to be able to carry out the day-to-day activity. You need to have a house, a child-friendly house, but this is very difficult to sort of explain exactly what kind of resources. Of course, you need to have trained forensic interviewers. You need to have that, definitely. That's core activity. You need to have specialized medical people that come in for the medical examination. And of course, you need to have these all these agencies involved. I don't know if I'm really responding to your concerns, Carmen, on that. Maybe you can you follow up on that?
Yes, I can see that Carmen replied yes. So Carmen, please feel free to ask any follow-up questions. But to your question, Bragi, it seems this was at least a part of the answer that she was looking for.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. Then there is Susanna on children with disabilities. Well, this is a good question because we need to adapt to the different needs of children. And we know children with disabilities are generally more vulnerable and therefore are in more risk as they are defenseless. So we need to be equipped in sort of retrieving children with all types of disabilities, whether that be physical or learning disabilities or whatever. And what we do here is that we collaborate with the state diagnostic institution that have expertise in disabilities in helping us out when we're dealing with different types of disabilities, like, for example, autism. There are special interviewing techniques that have been developed to meet the needs of children with disabilities. But as disabilities they're so diverse in nature, so there is not any one procedure that can be applied. But you need really to start off by mapping the child's sort of disability and the possible ways in which you could approach the child and meet the child on his or her basis. So this needs to be done in a very careful way. And the answer to that is really, like in any other child-sensitive services, that you need to look for the expertise in this area, and you need to collaborate, and you need to design a plan to meet that particular child's needs for being able to provide the services, and of course elicit the disclosure. Are there more?
There is so far only one more question that I can see. It's from Fiona, and the question is, in order to access therapy, is a court outcome required or CPS evaluation that appears have occurred? What of those two is required?
Yes, thank you for bringing this out. This is exactly what I feel is so great about the Barnahus concept, and that is, if you have this arrangement of having, if you manage to fulfill the requirements of the due process in the investigative phase, you can start the therapy immediately after, and that means that the criterion of burden of proof has no meaning. You simply provide the therapy on the basis of an assessment of the needs of the child. And that is done, I think I can say, in all the Barnahuses in Nordic countries, that the therapy starts immediately after the interview if the professionals assess that the child has experienced abuse, has been the victim of violence in any form. The child receives the appropriate help and therapy that is needed. So the burden of proof doesn't come into the picture at all.
Very much. So far from what I can see, those are all the questions, and before we tune off, you have the opportunity to maybe write one or two more questions down, but I ask you for your patience for just a few more minutes, because first we have a few polls for you to see how much you like this webinar and to get also information for our future webinars, what we should change and to do differently. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, the certificates will be available. Please feel free to request the certificate on this address, our usual email, and you will receive your certificate. What I'm very happy to announce now is that if you thought this session today was useful and if you liked it, then you will be very happy to learn that there is a next webinar, because this is a webinar series. There is a next webinar planned already for Next week, May 24th, it will start at 4 p.m. Central Time Zone, so 1 hour later than this one today, and it will deal with the applying Barnahus concepts to local realities. So basically, if you got intrigued and inspired with the wonderful presentation today, and once again, there is not enough thanks to say to our wonderful presenter, then the next webinar is aims to give you a bit more understanding of how you can, what you can do to apply it in your local context. So this is all from our side. Thank you very much once again. First, thank you, many thanks to our presenter, and of course thank you to all of us for staying with us over an hour. We hope it was useful, and we are looking forward to see your feedback in the polls. If you, of course, in the bottom left corner, you saw the links for ChildHub newsletter. This is, if you sign in here, you will be, it's good for you to receive regular updates about the upcoming webinars, and on the ChildHub webinars link that you have in the same bottom left corner, you can click there to see the upcoming sessions and stay tuned for the follow-up sessions also planned for June as part of this webinar series. So once again, thank you very much for joining. Thank you very much for a great presentation. It was a pleasure to have you all here today, and we are looking forward to seeing you all on May 24th.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all.